Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Global Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to welcome you to the Alpha community. Now, I've prepared this movie to help you make the transition from Canon EOS into Sony Alpha. So let's make a start. Now, I will be able to support you after you've watched this movie. I have a website called markgaylor.com. All of the information on this website is free. I'm not going to try and make any additional money out of you. If you do, however, download 5 ebooks and all of my Photoshop actions and Lightroom presets, you may want to make a $1 or $2 donation. You're coming from a mirror camera, a DSLR, into a mirrorless system. So I just thought I need to state the obvious, really, in that if you're looking for the mirror on your mirrorless camera, you basically don't have one. Now, when you remove the lens from the camera, you're going to be staring directly at that sensor. First thing is you probably want to get used to changing the lenses away from windy conditions, maybe even pointing the camera down to the ground as you change lenses, and just blow the camera chamber out at the end of each day to keep that sensor nice and clean. There is a cleaning option in the menus if you just need to vibrate that sensor to get rid of any dust that's still sitting there. Now, if you are taking the lens off a DSLR and you pop the mirror up, you may notice that the shutter mechanism is in the closed state. Now, the mirrorless camera that you purchased also has a shutter mechanism, but you'll see that that is parked out of the way. And the reason that is parked out of the way is the way the viewfinder or finder on a mirrorless camera works. It's basically being given a live view from that sensor. You get a what you see is what you get view. So you can't have the shutter mechanism hiding the view, otherwise you're not going to see anything in the electronic viewfinder. Now, and obviously the DSLR technologies are giving you the view in the optical viewfinder via the mirror. So there is a little bit of a change in the technology you've purchased, and so you probably will become fully conversant, and this will eventually seem the obvious way for cameras to work eventually. A couple of buttons on the front of your DSLR. You may or may not have these buttons, but I've just taken a random Canon camera. This is the 5D Mark IV. You'll see that there's a depth of field preview button on the left of this image here, and you'll also see a remote control terminal port on the right. Now, if you're looking for these buttons on your new Sony camera, you're not going to find them. First off, the view that you're seeing in that electronic viewfinder is showing you a live view of the depth of field. You're looking at the image through the stop-down aperture. So if you're photographing this landscape at f11, you're seeing the amount of depth of field. Now with a DSLR, you're actually viewing the scene with the widest aperture, and then it takes the image by closing the aperture at the point of making that image. So again, very different ways that DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are working. And some people love the way that you're actually seeing what you're going to capture. It will lead to you chimping reviewing your images so often because you've been looking at the image that you then capture. There is often very few differences between what you were looking at and what the camera then records. Now there is a remote port. It's on the side of the camera, not on the front, and you'll see it there with the little word multi on the camera body. It's actually a micro USB terminal. It'll take the wired remote, and I put down the number there of the Sony remote. Other manufacturers will make remotes that fit into this. You can actually, for instance, buy intervalometers that will fit into that same port. Just remember, when you go shopping for these wired remotes or intervalometers, make sure it's got that micro USB connection, okay, because it will be dependent on whether you can then attach it to your Sony camera. Okay, there is also a wireless remote. Now you still plug the wireless remote into that port, but basically the wireless receiver will then sit presumably on the top of the camera. You don't actually have to have a remote at all. If you're just looking to trigger the camera from a remote location, you can actually just use the control with smartphone feature. Just look for that in the menus, switch it on. You might need to download the Sony Play Memories camera app, and then you can control all of the camera's operations, including the shutter speed, aperture, focus point, using your smartphone. So that can be a very useful feature, and the app that you download is free, so that basically can be a very useful way of working with your Sony camera. Okay, let's just flip the camera around. So we're looking at the back side of this Canon, and you'll see, of course, we have the optical viewfinder. And it's important to note, remember, we're not using optical viewfinders, we're using electronic viewfinders. And often that requires the acronym of EVF, or just Finder. Now you'll see that just at the top of that Finder window, there's another very much smaller window, and this is called the eye sensor. Basically, the view that you're looking at will either appear on the rear monitor or in the Finder, usually not both at the same time. So the camera really knows that your eye has gone to the Finder because it detects the proximity of something close to that eye sensor. Now, I see on forums quite often people do allow that eye sensor to get dirty, and then the camera thinks that there's always an eye close to the Finder, and therefore you don't see the view on the back of the camera. If that ever happens to you in a couple of months' time, just remember these wise words: clean the eye sensor periodically, and you won't have that happen to you. Now, you may be coming from a Canon camera which has a touch panel which you can select menu items. The Sony 3rd generation A7 cameras and the A9 have a touch panel, but it's only used for focus. So, and that won't be on by default. If you do want to use that touch panel for indicating where to focus, you will need to go again into the menus, look for that little toolbox or camera setup icon, and then go and look at the touch panel options there. And there are a number of options how you can decide to work with the monitor for touching and gaining focus. Let's go back to or go to the top of the camera. Now, the shoot mode dial on this particular Canon camera is on the left there. And you'll have, if you're a keen amateur photographer, you'll probably come out of auto or program mode and are now shooting in TV or AV, time value or aperture value. Now, Canon is quite unique in this regard. Most manufacturers don't refer to the shutter speed as time value. So when you're looking at the Sony shoot mode dial, you're just going to see A and S, aperture priority and shutter priority. You probably already figured that one out, but I thought I'd better be comprehensive in this support movie. On the Canon shoot mode dial, you'll see the letter B. This stands for bulb. This is for when you want to tell the camera when to start exposing, and then tell it again when to stop exposing. You usually need to do work with a remote release to be able to do this, and this is typically when you're doing long exposures with neutral density filters. If you're looking on the Sony shoot mode dial, that B is not there. And the reason it's not there, it's just linked to when you're controlling shutter speeds. You'll carry on past 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, etc. You'll get to 30 seconds, and then after 30 seconds, the word bulb should appear. Now, occasionally it won't appear. And there are two reasons it won't appear, and one is you're in continuous shooting. You're set up to shoot sports, not single shooting where you just want one landscape image. And rather than bulb being grayed out, it just simply won't appear. And one of the forum questions that again I do see quite a lot is, where has bulb gone? And I will typically just have to respond is set the drive mode to single shooting, and bulb will then reappear. The only reason that it may not reappear is if you're shooting silent mode. You're not using the mechanical shutter, you're using a full electronic shutter, and again bulb will be just not appear in the menu if that is what you're doing. Shoot mode dial again, we have these are ways of programming or recording groups of camera settings. So when you change from shooting a portrait to a landscape, you don't have to go and choose another 6 different menu options. You can basically record them and just simply switch between C1, C2, C3. Now on the shoot mode dial of the Sony, we don't have C1, C2, C3, we just have 1, 2, and on some of the Sony cameras you will have a number 3. The reason that we don't call them C is because there are C buttons, there are custom buttons, and you can see just to the right side there, there's C1, C2. We'll also have a C3 and C4 elsewhere on the camera. Now these buttons can be reprogrammed to do pretty much anything that you want to do by simply pressing that C button. If you want to save a group of camera settings, you're not going to be able to do that simply by turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2, possibly 3. This is only to recall the groups of settings you've already saved. So if you want to save a group of settings, you're going to have to dive into the menus. You can see I'm in the first camera menu there, the camera setup menu, and you can see that I'm coming down to the menu item called memory. Now if you press the center button in the middle of that control wheel on the back of the camera, this is going to go in so that you can then enter in your group of settings. Now however the camera is set up, this is what you're going to be registering as a memory setting. So the first thing you'll want to do is maybe decide a position, 1, 2, 3 if you have it. You'll also notice there are some M1, M2, M3, M4 settings. Those M settings are only saved to the memory card, and they will be deleted when the memory card is reformatted. So they're very much a temporary way of recording groups of settings or sharing them with a friend who has the same model Alpha camera. You can actually drag these M settings to your computer and save them basically on a hard drive if that's what you want to do. Most people will just use that 1 and 2 setting there. Once you've done that, again, just hit the center of that control wheel, just hit the center button there, and those will be saved. Now there is another way of recording groups of settings to maybe override the group of settings you're currently shooting in. So maybe you've registered some sports action shoot settings to 1 or 2 and you've dialed them in, but the runner that you're photographing and you're shooting them at maybe 10 frames per second suddenly stops. So are you going to carry on shooting them at 10 frames per second, or are you just going to hold down a custom button that overrides that continuous shoot mode and will now start shooting just 1 frame every time you press the shutter release? So we can quickly alternate between groups of settings in a number of different ways. Now each time I talk on a topic, you'll probably find I have a separate movie on my Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel that covers this menu item in much greater detail. So I will just introduce you to some of these features, and if you don't quite understand the full implications of this but it sounds interesting, just have a look for those other movies. Let's look at the top of the camera, right side this time. We're looking at WB on the Canon, which is white balance. We can also see there on the top of the camera grip, we can see main dial. And right down at the bottom there, dioptric adjustment knob, which is by the optical viewfinder. This is for fine-tuning the sharpness of the viewfinder for somebody who normally wears glasses but doesn't want to wear glasses while taking photographs. Let's take a look at the equivalents on your Sony mirrorless body. We don't have a main dial, we have 2 dials. We have front dial and rear dial. This for me is an advantage over this system personally. You may have a different opinion, but typically we can control 2 different camera settings with a front and rear dial. For instance, if you're in manual exposure mode, you could control the shutter speed and the aperture by using the front and rear dial. We don't have to use a rear control wheel, or we don't have to hold down one of the buttons and then spin the same dial to change what it's adjusting. We have the front and rear dial, which seem to serve most professional photographers really quite well. And Sony isn't the only manufacturer that does provide a front and rear dial. Now, we don't have a button that says WB, okay, white balance, but most Sony cameras, and this may not be the case on your Sony model, but Sony have been assigning white balance to C1, custom 1 button. Now, if you're an auto white balance shooter and you don't find yourself changing your white balance that often, you're not locked into using C1 for white balance. You could just change white balance in the main menus or assign a different button, and you could reassign C1 to do something completely different, which is what I've done on my own Alpha body. We also have the diopter adjustment dial, different name, same thing. It is a little bit more hidden out of view on the Sony Alpha bodies because it's sort of sitting behind the rubber eye cup. So just remember the camera does have it, so go in there and make sure that the view that you're looking at, whether you're wearing glasses or not wearing glasses, is as sharp as it should be. Going back to the camera body, we have a button that would appear to do two things on the Canon, which is drive and AF. Again, we don't have a drive or AF button on the top of the Sony camera. We need to go to the back of the Sony camera to pick up the drive mode. Now, the word drive isn't listed, but we have a couple of icons there. One is of a little watch timer, and the other one is multiple images, and this basically is your drive mode. Drive mode will allow you to go from single shooting or continuous shooting or a timer or bracket shooting. Now, every time you come to an option and you see that there's a little arrow either side, that means you can navigate left or right because there are other menu items. For instance, in continuous shooting, when we want to do bursts of shots, will be broken up into different speeds: low, mid, high, and there's a setting on the Sony Alpha cameras called High Plus. Now, that is actually the fastest frame rate, but there are instances where you don't want to go for the fastest frame rate. High Plus isn't actually used by most sport shooters when they're having to pan the camera, and that is because High Plus doesn't give you a live view when you're looking through the electronic viewfinder. You need to come back down to the high setting. So for instance, on a camera such as the A7 III, which is capable of shooting 10 frames per second, you actually need to come down to the high setting, 8 frames per second, so that you can reliably pan. If you're not panning the camera, just be happy to use that 10 frames per second high plus, and that will be okay. But if you are needing to pan, it will be much easier to follow your subject if you're in the high continuous shoot setting. And you may have missed that in the manual, so that is some hopefully you find really useful advice there. In the Canon menu, in the drive mode, you might have options for doing that single shooting and continuous shooting in a more silent mode. It is important to point out that silent shooting on a Sony camera is completely silent, not just quieter, but completely silent. Now, it uses a full electronic shutter. Okay, and you won't find that in the drive mode settings. Again, you'll need to go into the camera menu. We can assign silent shooting into a more accessible place. You don't have to remember where it is in the main menus, but if you do want to go from the mechanical shutter into a full electronic shutter, then at the moment you're going to go into the menu. Now, you won't always want to stay in silent shooting, okay? Now, you're not going to be shooting action sports on the A7 III, A7R3 cameras. You will on the A9, but not on the A7 III and A7R3, because you can get some shutter distortion. You're not going to be able to freeze your fast-moving subject in silent shooting mode. Another thing to watch out for silent shooting is if you're working with artificial light sources. Occasionally, when you're using silent shooting with maybe fluorescent lighting, you will get bands across your image. And again, that is another popular forum topic where people say, what are these uneven lighting bands across my image? And of course, the answers from the more experienced Sony users come straight back: switch off silent shooting. So again, it's a great feature. If you're trying to photograph maybe a violin rehearsal recital and you need to make absolutely no noise, there is a good use for silent shooting, but just remember it does have its limitations. Top of the camera, we're moving along those row of buttons. We have exposure, compensation, and ISO. Now let's go and look at the Sony camera. Hard to miss, I have to say. That exposure compensation dial is very big. And the reason it's so useful on a mirrorless camera, I have to say, is because of that live view. If you're underexposing, your find of view is going to be dark. If you're overexposing, it's going to be too light. And generally what happens with mirrorless shooters is they almost intuitively, almost without thinking anymore, start adjusting the exposure until the brightness is exactly the way they want it in the viewfinder. We also have the option to work with a histogram in the viewfinder, so we can also see a graphical representation of whether the exposure is just right or under or over. And so this is a very useful dial for mirrorless cameras. And I have seen one or two new players into the mirrorless market who have forgotten to put this dial on. Bit of an oversight, I think, for mirrorless cameras, because it is so useful for that live view. Let's take a look at ISO. It was on the top of the camera for the Canon. Again, it's on the right side of the control wheel for the Sony Alpha cameras. Just press the right side of the control wheel and we'll go into our ISO options. Now the camera by default out of the box was probably in auto ISO. We can press the right side of that dial a second time and come across, because we can set a lower and upper limit to that ISO range that the camera will be given permission to use when working in auto ISO. Now the upper limit will probably be set to 6400, but because these Sony Alpha sensors are so good at high ISO, some photographers, including myself, will raise that from 6400 to 12800. Now, the images won't be completely noise-free at 12,800, and really whether you want to do this or not really depends on your pain threshold for noise. So that may be something that you want to explore with, and just find your own comfortable upper limit to the ISO, but it's there to change if you want to. Hot shoe, that may seem like an obvious thing. You've probably seen that there's one on the top of the Sony camera, so why am I highlighting this? And because, as with anything different, you might assume that the hot shoe is doing exactly the same thing on the Sony, when in fact it's not. Okay, so the hot shoe, around that center pin on the Canon, you'll see 4 other pins where additional communication goes through, especially to when you bought a Canon flash, such as this Canon 430EX with your Canon camera. It's doing more than just triggering the flash. There's a little bit more to that communication, controlling exposure, etc., etc. So if you bought that pair to work together, that is the additional communication going through those additional pins. Now, you don't see those additional pins around the center of that central pin, but the additional pins are there. They're on the leading or top edge, and Sony don't actually call it a hot shoe. They call it a multi-interface shoe, which you might just think, oh, that's just a fancy name for a hot shoe. But Sony have decided that it's not going to be just a hot shoe. Yes, it can be a hot shoe to trigger flashes, but it can be used to drive other intelligent devices through that series of pins that you may not have noticed. Now, when you purchase the camera, you'll probably notice a little black cap there. I probably would go and invest in a spare little black cap, because for my liking, those little pins look a little bit too sensitive to corrosion, weather, if you lose that cap. So I would definitely buy one before you lose one approach to that. But if you do pull off that little black cap to mount your flash, you'll see those pins on that leading edge, and there's more than 4. There's lots of pins, because Sony can communicate a lot of information through this multi-interface shoe. So if you're looking for the equivalent to that 430 EX Canon flash, then Sony's equivalent would be the Sony HVL F45RM. It's a wireless radio flash, so it can be used off camera if you have a commander to talk to that flash. And so again, I've listed the Sony commander. Now, not everybody is going to invest in Sony flash gear to go with their Sony camera. I think more people choose not to invest. The Chinese flashes are usually half the price or less than the proprietary systems made by, say, Canon or Sony or Nikon. Now, a word of warning, some people get on very, very well with, say, a Chinese brand such as Godox. But you will see forums, and I've seen these forums, where people are saying, well, my flash doesn't talk to my camera. For instance, I'm having trouble setting high-speed sync, or I get this problem, or I get that problem. Now, you'll never see those questions about the Sony flash. You'll only ever see the forums, which is they're really expensive. Well, less problems, a little bit more money. Again, you might decide to save money and go for that Chinese brand. But if you do, just make sure that on the forums, people are perfectly happy with that model on that model camera and there are no communication problems. So not all flashes will work seamlessly with the Sony. So before you invest, just double check, do your research. If you're buying a Sony flash, you don't have to do that research. Okay, just buy that Sony flash. Just remember there are Sony flash systems which are not wireless. They'll communicate via infrared. The wireless are a little bit more sophisticated and they're the latest model Sony flashes. So it's that RM at the end of the flash name, which is that radio flash that you're looking for. What else could go on that multi-interface shoe? Okay, here's one item that I personally use. I use a wireless microphone. Now the little part, that little one on the pair, that goes on the top of the camera, and the other one will go in my pocket, and I can walk 50 meters away from the camera and start talking to the camera in movie mode, and all of my audio will go through that wireless communication and be recorded on the movie. And just remember, the closer the microphone is to the speaking voice, the cleaner the sound and the less ambient interference noise that you'll have in that audio. Some people will prefer to use a boom mic on the multi-interface shoe, and that is another option. Again, the Sony microphones might communicate more information, so again, do a little bit of research before you invest in a microphone. If we pop open the door on a Canon camera, certainly one of the higher models that use 2 card slots, you'll probably find that one of those card slots is a CF card and the other one is an SD card. Now, if you've got the 3rd generation of Sony mirrorless cameras and the A0 or the A9, you're going to have a dual card slot as well. Both of them are SD cards, but both slots are not the same. It is the lower of the slots, which is called slot 1, which is the fast UHS 2 slot. This will communicate very rapidly when you're writing files that have just been captured, maybe firing off at 10 frames a second. The buffer of the camera is going to clear much, much faster if you put a fast card in that lower slot. And now you can set up the camera to do various things with that upper slot. You can use it as an insurance policy, record the same file to the top slot. You can have the camera record movies to the top slot and stills to the bottom slot. You could just have the camera record to slot 1 until it's full and then start recording to slot 2. So you've got those choices and you will find those choices in the menus. So just remember to look at those menus so you set the camera up the way you want it to work. Back of camera, we have a start stop. Now there is a little lever on that Canon there which will allow us to choose whether we start shooting movies or to go into live view mode. Now live view mode on a DSLR basically puts the mirror up and out of the way, and then it tries to pretend it's a mirrorless camera. We don't have to do that with a mirrorless camera because we have constant live view. Now I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or two. We do have that to be used as a movie start-stop. We also have the multi-controller. A lot of people just refer to this as the joystick. We can quickly navigate menu items or move focus points around the screen. Very important for action shooters. Then we have the control dial, which Sony call the control wheel, and then we have a set button, and which Sony call the center button, but pretty much does the same thing. Now the movie button is worth talking to a little bit. Now there is a movie icon on the shoot mode dial, but you can be shooting stills in aperture priority or shutter priority and press the movie button and start recording a movie. But it won't start recording the movie in shutter priority or aperture priority unless you set the camera up to do that when shooting movies. Typically what it'll do by default is it will start using program exposure mode even though you're in aperture priority mode on the shoot mode dial. So that is worth noting there. Okay, so the other thing you can also do is you don't have to start movies with that little red button. There is a menu item that if you choose the movie icon on the shoot mode dial, you can use the shutter release button to start and stop movies. And again, you'll have to switch that menu item on. Multi-selector. Okay, again, it's the joystick. Just the word to probably has for some reason eluded some people who are bought into these cameras. Not only can you move that controller to the left, to the right, up or down or diagonally, you can also press it in. Okay, pressing it in will actuate a certain thing. Now by default, if you're shooting with a wide focus area on a Sony, it will switch to focusing in the center of the screen, something called focus standard. Now you can actually change what that multi-selector when pressed in does, so it's another thing that you can take control of to set up and customize the camera for you. We have the control wheel and we have the center button, pretty much the same as we do on that Canon. Okay, back over the camera again. We're still talking about movie mode, and I said that unless you set that movie mode button to do something that is not program mode, you need to go into those menus. So where would you go? Press the menu button would be a good place to start. Go to the camera 2 menu there. In movie 1 page, just come to exposure mode. This is where we can choose shutter priority, aperture priority, full manual. You get to choose what it is that you want to do, so that when next time you then press that little red button, you're going to be shooting movies the way you want to shoot movies. For instance, my priority when shooting movies is shutter priority. I like to be shooting movies at 1/50th of a second, and if I'm shooting in very bright ambient conditions with a wide aperture, I will have to use a neutral density filter in those instances. It's a sort of a semi-pro or professional way of shooting movies, which is to prioritize the shutter speed you're using. It avoids what's called choppy movies. File formats. Now, some of the terminology that Canon give to their movies, you definitely wouldn't be picking the movies without reading the manual. It's a little bit easier with the Sony. There are less confusing options, I have to say. So file format, this is where you choose the quality. You'll see that there's probably 2 or 3 different file formats. If you're looking for the best quality files, you'll be looking for the XAVCS file format. You will find an older AVC HD format, and you might find an MPEG file format, which might be suitable just for recording look-see movies that you upload to social media. But for best high quality movie recording, you're looking for that XAVCS. Now you can switch between HD and 4K. Just remember, 4K you can run for just under half an hour, but only so long as the camera doesn't overheat in that process. So if you're shooting in full sun and you've got the monitor into the body, the camera will build up heat. You'll be warned that the camera is getting warm before the camera has to shut down to protect the sensor. So a lot of people can get away and shoot with the full just shy of half an hour, but just a word of warning, 4K. And if you're shooting at a very high quality setting, which is the record settings, which is the next option, you will create some very large files to edit in post-production. That second setting, record setting, the first number is your frame rate, and this will vary depending on what region you are in the world. For those in North America, you might find that you've got choices of 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. But in Australia, where I'm recording this movie, it's 25 and 50 and 100. And this is all to do with the power grid. Okay, the Sony manufacturer is protecting us from having flickering lights because of the different frequencies of the power systems between different countries. So the camera should be set up for your country if you didn't buy a grey import or buy the camera overseas. So worth checking for that when you can actually switch those settings again in the menus. So that second number, that after the first number, for instance in this screen view we've got 100M. The higher the number, the lower the compression. The lower the compression, the better the quality of the movie. The only downside of this is the file gets bigger, so it will fill up your memory card more quickly. But if you're looking for best quality settings, XAVCS with a low compression rate, and that is a high second number. Picture profile. Now, picture profiles have no effect on RAW files. They will, however, be used by most videographers to style or create, manage the contrast of their movie file. Because remember, if we're not shooting movies in RAW, if we overexpose those highlights, so there's no bringing them back. So when we're shooting video, we often want to play around with the contrast in a very sophisticated way. And we can do that using the picture profiles. For still shooters, it's usually switched off because it has no impact on the raw files. But for movie shooters, you may want to play with those profiles. Now, the first 6 of those profiles, and as we get up to PP6, a PP6 is actually a very good profile for recording movies in full sunlight. It will slow down the risk of you overexposing the highlights. There is another feature which I don't have time to go into today, which is something called zebras, which is a warning system of how bright those highlights are going. You can also use that. There are picture profiles beyond PP6, and you should really only use those if you do some additional research. PP7, PP8, they're log profiles. They do require that you modify your overall exposure, and they will require a lot of hard work in post-production to get that movie looking right. So you may have heard about S-Log2 or S-Log3 and you just dive in and use it. They will cause you a headache if you're inexperienced at grading video files that have been shot with a log profile. So just a word of warning there. You've got some great professional features, but you just have to be a little bit careful about using them if you're inexperienced with shooting movies. Live view display, that was the other flip side of that button on the Canon. We could start, stop movies, but we could also switch on and switch off the live view of a DSLR. Now, we have constant live view on the mirrorless, but there is a very occasional reason that we want to switch live view off. One of those reasons, and again, it's a popular question that I'm answering on the forums, is somebody gets into a studio working with off-camera flash, which is not Sony gear. And what the camera is doing, because it's trying to give you a live view of how underexposed your image would be if you set the aperture at f11, the shutter speed at 1/250th, you'll have chosen those settings because they're what you want for the flash. But the camera can't see the flash because it hasn't gone off, so it shows you what the dark studio looks like, which is completely black. Okay, so people will go and put on a forum, I'm trying to work in a studio and I can't see anything. I can't focus on the model because there is nothing to be seen on the camera. So in this particular instance, switching live view off is what you want to do. People working with Sony commanders, Sony flash off camera, don't complain about this because Sony recognizes what is happening, so automatically switches this setting off without you even knowing that the camera has done it. So what switching this live view setting off does is it makes the electronic viewfinder behave as if it was an optical viewfinder. It will now use the widest aperture of the lens, not the aperture you've chosen to shoot the subject. So you're no longer getting live view depth of field preview. You know, the camera is just trying to help you out by opening the aperture so you can see something. And in most instances, the electronic viewfinder in this very dark scene will actually give you a much brighter image than had you been using an optical viewfinder. So it's a plus. You actually get the advantages of an electronic viewfinder, and in very dark conditions the viewfinder will look really bright. It's almost like giving you night vision, and when it gets really dark, these electronic viewfinders are that good. Two more buttons on the Canon. We have the Info button and Q button, and most Canon users that know that these two buttons can work together to give you certain advantages when choosing menu items on the back of the camera. Now, often we're looking at the actual view. A lot of Sony shooters will actually frame and compose their image using the back of the camera. They don't feel the need to put the camera to their eye. So this particular view can be replicated on the Sony, but it's not the normal or standard view. If you wanted to get to that view, just start pressing the display button. You'll now start cycling through different levels of information. So in this particular view, I've got a level guide to show me whether the camera is being used slightly crooked. If you keep pressing that display button, eventually, depending on how you got the camera set up, you'll come to this 4 viewfinder view. It's called the 4 viewfinder view because it assumes you're now going to be using the camera finder rather than the monitor. So now you can view all of those settings that you're shooting with. Now you not only can see those settings, but you can now start modifying those settings. Before I show you how to start modifying the settings, I'll show you first how you can change what levels of information you can see by pressing that display view. So go into the camera menu, hit the display button. You will be given a choice of whether to use the finder or monitor because you can have different levels of information for each. When you hit the monitor view, you can see I've got 5 levels of information. Now, if that's too many levels, you can uncheck some of them and then hit the enter button and reduce that, or you can switch them all on and have 7 different levels of information. Okay, well, actually one of those levels is actually no information. It's switching the monitor off. Okay, so, but at least you can see that we have choices there about what information that we can see. Once you're in that 4 viewfinder view, if you want to go into some of those menu items to modify them, hit the FN button, which is the function button on the back of the camera. You can then navigate using the control wheel or the multi-selector tool. If the camera is to the eye, okay, we can actually still change these settings by using the front and rear dial. Now, if we have a single row of information to make options and choices, we'll be using the front dial. Some options that we will choose have sub-settings. Okay, they have multiple other settings that we can choose. For instance, flexible spot has 3 different choices about how large you want that spot, small, medium or large. If we get a row of options below the line, then we can select those using the rear dial. Now, you might need to practice this, and it might seem a little bit complicated when you first do it, but trust me, you can navigate and modify options exceedingly quickly with the camera at the eye without lowering the camera at all, and make different choices about what you're shooting and how you're shooting very, very quickly. If you're not in that 4 viewfinder view, if you press the FN key, you'll come to a menu called the function menu. You'll see 2 rows of information. Now, the options in these 2 rows are customizable, and I have to say that Sony have set up options there which don't double handling some things. You might have an option to change ISO, but we also can change ISO on the control wheel. So there are many instances. For instance, half of these items could be changed, and you can put in something that is much more useful for you. The idea is to put your 12 most used settings in there so that you very rarely, if ever, have to go into the menus at all. Some people will say the Sony menu systems are confusing, but having said that, most people don't go into the menus when they're fully conversant with their Sony camera. So if I press that FN key, now I've listed this as a heads-up display. I don't have to be using the monitor. These options are also visible in the Finder as well, the EVF. Again, I can roll to the menu item that I want to adjust using the multi-selector, which is just by my thumb nearly always. Then I'm going to use the front dial for menu options on the top. If I see, for instance, ISO, auto, standard shutter speed, typically if I was using a 50mm lens, it would choose a shutter speed of a 50th of a second in low ambient light to make sure that I don't get camera shake. But in some instances, I want to raise that minimum shutter speed so that I don't get subject blur. So for this particular option, I have standard fast and faster, and standard slow and slower. And I can, if I go from standard to fast, it's going to double the minimum shutter speed, so I can avoid subject blur, for instance. Remember that lower row is controlled by the rear dial. And to give you an example, I'm shooting this with an 80mm lens, but I don't think an 80th of a second is enough to ensure that I freeze this subject, because this subject is sitting on a horse. He's trying to sit still, but his horse is moving around a bit. So I've just changed that setting very quickly from standard to fast, and quite quickly the minimum shutter speed now will be 1/160th of a second, and that will ensure the subject is sharp. With this particular menu item, and I have a separate movie just on this menu item, you'll find that I find this an incredibly useful feature, and it works in program mode and aperture priority mode. AF mode, okay, that was the flip side of that drive button. We've already looked at the drive options on that control wheel on the back of the Sony. So let's see where the AF mode is picked up. Now we have no assigned custom button out of the box to the focus mode. You will find it by default appearing in the FN menu, so it's very quickly can be accessed. But if for any reason that you're constantly shooting between what you call AI servo, I call AFC or continuous focus, then or continuous AF. If I'm switching between that and single shot, then okay, so single shot AF, AFS on the Sony camera. If you're constantly shooting with that in your own workflow, you might want to assign a custom button to access this feature much more quickly. Now there are a couple of custom buttons that usually I don't have anything assigned to them. For instance, on most Sony cameras, the down button on the control wheel doesn't do anything, but you can assign a function to it. Also, the trash can, the C4 button, often has nothing assigned to it. So if you want to assign focus mode without having to dive into the function menu and navigate to that option, you can cut out one step there by simply assigning a custom button to focus mode. And again, quickly, if you do pick it up from the function menu, again, you could be doing this with the camera to the eye, because that's a top row level adjustment. You're going to be using the front dial on the camera. You'll just do 2 clicks. Typically, you're going to cycle between AFS, single shooting, and AFC, continuous shooting. You will see there's a setting in the middle there. The auto AF is supposed to choose and toggle between AFC and AFS automatically. The Canons have this option as well, but I know Canon users don't use it because it's not ultra reliable. Same goes with the Sony shooters. Most Sony shooters will just bypass the automatic setting there. You will notice, however, to the right of AFC or continuous AF, there is a DMF option. That's direct manual focus, and you'll also have manual focus. These are really important settings, and I've noticed that on some of the new mirrorless cameras coming out again that they don't have this DMF setting. Now this makes manual focus or overriding the autofocus super easy again on mirrorless cameras because of that electronic view. So, and I have a separate movie on DMF or direct manual focus. This is where the camera uses autofocus first, and then you can fine tune simply by turning the focus ring on the lens. You can override the autofocus and fine tune using manual focus. This is an incredibly useful feature. And the reason that the original Sony cameras took off over 5 years ago was there were very few adapted lenses that could use autofocus. The smart adapters business was only just starting up. So a lot of people were adapting lenses but were manual focus only. And the reason people didn't hate these early mirrorless cameras because Sony proved it could be so fast and easy to use manual focus because of things like focus peaking and magnify view. Just remember, you can, if you are switching between all of those focus modes, you can assign a custom key for that. Typically, for instance, you might want to assign C4. If you want to do that, just dive into the menus, come to that second camera menu tab there, page 8 on my particular Sony camera here that I'm using to demonstrate this. You're going to go into custom key, choose the custom button you want to modify, assign a function or override the existing function, and then it will be yours to control. The other thing I was talking about, the manual focus and the DMF, you'll find the settings for this in the Focus Assist page. Now, if you will be using your Sony camera in manual focus, or you like the idea of this DMF after you watch the movie as well, you'll be hooked on it, is you will go into this menu and look for the MF Assist. This is linked to the DMF so that as soon as you turn the focus ring, it will automatically magnify the view, and you can switch on a feature called focus peaking so that when an edge is sharp, it will be highlighted with a color of your choosing to say, this is sharp, now take the shot. So that's why it's so quick and easy to use these cameras in manual focus and DMF. The only exceptions to drive mode and focus modes is if you have invested in what I think is the most advanced camera on the planet, which is the A9 camera. Is this particular camera has the focus mode and drive mode as hard dials on the top left of the camera. On the other cameras, basically we're looking at a smooth surface with nothing there. So if you have that, then you won't be needing to go into the function menu or assign custom buttons for those because they're already assigned. There's a slight downside to assigning a focus mode and drive mode here is because when you choose a memory recall, it can't override this hard dial, but there is a way around that using the register custom shoot settings. So that is another movie that I've made to cover that feature of these Sony mirrorless cameras. One more button. Okay, top right on this particular Canon camera, AF point selection button. Let's take a look at what Sony would do to this. This is typically assigned to focus area, and on most of the Sony cameras it's assigned by default to C2. I find it such a useful feature, I have just left this C2 button doing that straight out of the box. Now, I'm not saying your camera will do exactly that. This is one movie to cover all, and Sony could change the nature of what C2 button does, but if you like the idea of choosing focus area using the C2 button, then again I've looked at how you can do that by changing the nature of the custom buttons. If I press C2, we're going to be able to again use the front dial because it's a top row adjustment. We can then cycle left or right to change the focus areas. Now, a lot of Canon shooters I know, when they're tracking things in AI servo mode, which is continuous AF, they will often favor a small group of AF points because they have more reliable AF tracking. The only difficulty then is keeping those AF points on the subject. Having said that, the Sony wide focus area is exceptionally wide, 693 AF points on some of the cameras wide, nearly total coverage of the sensor. Wide is super wide on these sensors, and it is very, very reliable. So if you're used to using just a small AF cluster of AF points, don't be afraid of broadening that focus area. The wide is exceptionally reliable on these Sony cameras. It's one of the reasons they've been voted cameras of the year. Every time a new camera model comes out, DP Review will name it camera of the year. The A7 III, the A7R III were no exceptions. So most of the time I am using a wide focus area. So if I can't keep the small cluster of focus points, I don't need to, because as long as I can keep the subject in the viewfinder, the camera will focus. And what it likes focusing on is things that are close to the center but also close to the camera. There are instances where that isn't always the case, but I have to say 90% of my own shots, that does tend to be the case. And it's why it's the defaults for Sony is to choose a wide focus area, and that's the way your camera probably comes out of the box. Now you might move to a smaller focus area using reduced number of focus points, but give the wider focus areas a go on your Sony because they are reliable. This was another one captured with a wide focus area, even though the subject is not in the center. Even if it gets more over to the left because it's the closest thing to the camera is going to be very reluctant to pull focus on the background because it likes that subject which is close to the camera. So it uses a very good algorithm which is 90% reliable, maybe more, at keeping the subject sharp. Focus area, there will be times where you do want to pull the focus area smaller. Now I would come down in small increments. So the first increment I would come down to is something that I call zone. Now, having said zone, this is like your wide focus area on your Canon. Zone is actually quite a big focus area, but it's no longer almost the entire surface area of the sensor. So in this instance, I've actually got this character who's like 3 deep. There are 2 characters who are much closer to the camera. So I'm a little bit nervous about the camera suddenly deciding that one of these near subjects, even though they're towards the edge of the frame, might suddenly snap into focus, especially if that guy on the left of the image leans in slightly, the camera is likely to pick it up. So what I'm doing is I'm coming down to a zone. I can move that zone around the screen. We've got like 9 positions of that zone. So I can just say now anything in that zone that is front and center is going to be my priority subject. I only come down to zone when wide is going to fail me. I only come down from zone when zone is likely to fail me. So here I am, I'm cycling down now to a spot. Okay, we're going to use very few points, and now I can choose whether it's a small, medium or large spot. And basically my choice will be directed by how much do I need to avoid stuff that is around that spot. And again, I will keep that spot large if I can just avoid the hand that is holding this little pocket camera that this guy is holding here. So long as my subject is front and center in that spot area, then if that's a large spot, I will choose large spot. I will only come down again if and when I have to. For instance, a bird hiding in branches, if I need to come in between 2 very small branches, I will choose maybe the small spot. Just remember, if you're going down into a very small focus area, the focus is only reliable if the camera can detect some sort of edge within that small focus area, and the Sony cameras prefer vertical edges rather than horizontal edges, so just be aware of that. Here the camera can quite easily pick up there's a little bit of a vertical edge running down the finder or monitor screen on that camera, so the camera is going to instantly snap focus there. But if you put a small spot AF area on, say, a wedding dress with no edge, then the camera focusing will start hunting backwards and forwards because it's looking for an edge and it can't find one. Now this is where it gets interesting. I looked into some of the Canon options for choosing focus, and I was surprised to see Canon devoted 60 pages to AF options. Oh, that's a lot of options. It's a little bit simpler. Well, maybe I should say a lot simpler on a Sony. Choose your focus area and then choose whether you want to lock on to a subject that doesn't then stay in that front and center position of your AF area. Now on the Canon, for instance, on this particular Canon, you could find it in this case 2, where it's trying to avoid obstacles that periodically come in between the camera and the subject that you're trying to track. So the camera has then a latent memory of the shape or color of the subject it's tracking and ignores momentary blindnesses because something has come across in between the subject and the camera. So these options exist. Now all of the focus areas exist in one group of options called the lock-on AF. Now what happens is you lock onto a subject that's front and center of the focus area, and then you don't have to keep it in that area of the focus area. The camera will track it pretty much around the entire viewfinder because of its big spread of AF points. All you've got to try and do is keep the subject inside the viewfinder, and then the camera will track. So we can choose to track using different focus areas that have a lock-on option, and now the camera will ignore momentary obstacles, as Canon put it, that get in between the subject and the camera. For instance, what I've chosen to do here is lock on to a subject that's on the extreme left side, and I can do that because of how big the focus area is on a Sony camera. So not only is the wide useful because it's a big area, but I can move a spot very close to the edge of the frame and still lock onto a subject. And now without even moving the camera, the bird takes flight. And because it's locked on to the owl's head, it then tracks the owl across the frame without me having to pan the camera or keep the focus area, the original focus area, on the subject. And so this is called a lock-on option for very good reason. Basically, the original focus points are given over to neighboring focus points as the subject tracks across the sensor area. Again, if we've got multiple options, they'll appear below that primary dial. So now we move over to the rear dial, and now I can move through other areas such as center, zone, over to a wide focus area with a lock-on option. And to give you an example, and I've actually posted this as a short movie on my YouTube channel where I think there was 89 frames, they were all sharp. But I started with lock-on AF wide because the cowboy is front and center. Now the lock-on may not have been needed, except in this instance it was because of something happens. Note the cowboy is on his horse, and now he's not on his horse. So where's the horse? Now the cowboy's moved a lot closer to the camera, but it's still pulling focus. But what happens now is the cowboy's horse travels in between the cowboy and the camera, but the camera ignores the horse because I'm using a lock-on option. Now, just to give you an idea, now I do have a 90-minute movie on focus. So I wanted to show you this image where maybe a lock-on wide AF area failed, because when it locked on to the subject, which was a dog in tall grass, it locked onto the grass in front of the dog, not the dog. It doesn't know the difference between dog and grass. It decides there are some edges. I will choose to lock onto that. And so when the dog runs forward, even though we're in continuous focus, it carries on tracking the grass. Okay, the grass was front and center when I started shooting. So in this instance, what I've decided to do, because of the tall grass, is we can choose a focus area such as zone that is just above the top of the grass, or I could reduce the focus area to a very small one. Each would be reliable, but if the dog is weaving left and right, zone might be easier. But now, even if the dog descends into the tall grass, it'll say, I'm not tracking something that is green, I'm tracking something that is pink, which is the tongue flapping or that little black nose, and it's going to remain faithful to that. Now, how faithful it remains to that can depend on a subsetting there. And again, I've got movies dedicated to focus and action sport shooting, and I can help you set your camera up for that and record all of those settings to one of the memories on the top of your camera. But how doggedly determined to stay with the original subject, because sometimes your camera might decide, actually I think it's best to give up on this subject because it hasn't appeared from behind the tall grass for 3 seconds or 2 seconds, depends on a sub menu item, and that is AF tracking sensitivity. 1, locked on, remains very faithful. Responsive means it's going to give up and track the next best thing within a very short amount of time. So we've got 1 to 5, and you can set that to a custom key if you like and cycle between the two if sports action is the only thing you do. I dived into the Canon options and literally they were endless, and I saw all sorts of menu items that simply just don't exist in the Sony menus, such as AF responsiveness, acceleration deceleration tracking, AF point auto switching. The Sony cameras just don't need them because the autofocus is so reliable. Get the AF area and the focus mode right, and you're going to be reliable. And I have to say, if you've got an A7 III or an A7R III or an A9 camera, these cameras can focus with the best of them. And we're talking with the best DSLRs. And in some instances, I have heard some DSLR users saying, I'm giving up on the DSLR because this A9 camera is much more reliable than my Canon 1DX Mark II or my Nikon D5. I'm not saying it is, but I know from the forums and new Sony users, people have come over, maybe for the IAF as a wedding shooter, maybe for the focus tracking for sports action shooters. Many people have got different reasons coming over to the Alpha family, and you may have your own reasons, but certainly Sony's kicking goals at the moment because for many people, the cameras are delivering. One of the features I haven't mentioned in those focus modes, because it's not a focus mode, well, it sort of is, but you won't find it in a menu item. It's called IAF. And again, on the forums are people hunting through the menus, and I know there's a lot of menus, and you're not going to see IF as an independent menu item to switch on or off. You'll only see it when you're changing custom key settings and you realize that one of the custom keys has already been set to IAF. Now, Sony for some time have been setting the IAF button to the center button in the middle of the control wheel. Now, many people who have fallen in love with this feature, and as I said, there's a lot of users who have come over to Sony just because of how reliable IAF is, and that is the ability not only to focus on a face, but find the eye in the face. And this becomes really useful when you're using a very wide aperture lens, say f1.8 or 1.4 even, to be able to pull focus not on the front of the nose but actually on the eye is an incredibly useful feature. And I've also used IAF in sports situations where there's somebody on a sports field who's running towards the camera, and I've found it easier to track them with IAF rather than just face detect or a larger focus area. So IAF, center button, but some people will often assign a button nearer the top of the camera, such as the AEL button. A lot of photographers don't use that automatic exposure lock feature very often, and I don't tend to use it very often for that either, because I have live view and I'll be using the exposure compensation dial instead. So I don't really need to lock the exposure in the workflow that I use. Now, one of the options, if you are going to assign it to a new button, is you will see that many lenses that you can buy for the Sony cameras have a button on the side of the lens. And this often will do a focus hold. So if you're in continuous focus, it will stop the focus so you can hold at a particular position. Some people, however, reprogram that button to do IAF. So there's a choice, IAF. Now, one of the things you do need to know about IAF on the later model cameras is it works in AFS and AFC, or AI servo, as some of you Canon users will be used to calling it. Now, on the older model Sony cameras, that may not be available in AFC, but certainly on the third generation, it's a very reliable feature and can be done in AFC. Now, if you are in AFS and you've got face detect on, you won't need to hold the focus hold button or the IAF button that you've programmed to bring up that little green square to come momentarily over the eye. It only appears momentarily in AFS to let you know it's found the eye. But in AFC, or continuous focus, you do need to keep that focus hold or IAF button down while it tracks the eye. And what will happen then is the little green box will basically stay on the eye as the figure moves around. And on the third generation of cameras, the person can even move into profile view, so the camera can only now see one eye, and the camera still recognizes it as the eye it's tracking. Now, it usually picks the eye that is closest to the camera, often referred to as the leading eye. There is no option to switch it to the other eye. If you do notice it chooses the other eye, it's usually because something has passed in front of the leading eye, like a lock of hair or something, or maybe there's a bit too much shadow there, so it goes for the other eye. But it is an incredibly useful feature, and is very useful when you're working with wide aperture prime lenses. Let's take a look at some of the features that may not be actually on your Canon camera, but they're definitely features you should be looking at now you've moved over to a Sony mirrorless second or even third generation camera, and that is image stabilization. Now, this is vibration reduction on Nikon's, IS image stabilizations on Canon's, OS on older Sony's, optical stabilization. But what it has happened with the Sony modern bodies is it's on the sensor, and this is vastly superior than it being built into the lenses, because we have 5-axis, not 2-axis stabilization on the sensor. So we can usually handhold cameras without camera shake much more efficiently with this image stabilization on the sensor. And Sony call their stabilization steady shot, and you might see a graphic on the top of the camera called steady shot inside, and that means it's the sensor that is stabilized. Now, it's on by default. If you come to this menu item and it's grayed out, it means that there's a button on your camera lens, and that means you can switch the steady shot on and off on the lens, and it also communicates with the camera. If the stabilization in the lens and in the body, Sony will very cleverly milk the best of both worlds and optimize maximum stabilization using both systems. Not all systems do this, but Sony's do. You can also go into those steady shot settings below, and if you're using a non-Sony lens through an adapter that doesn't communicate the focal length to Sony, you can tell Sony that this is a 50mm lens, so to stabilize this lens as if it was a 50mm lens. So you can customize that steady shot for non-Sony lenses. So why would you turn steady shot off? If the camera is on a tripod, okay, and you're using long exposures or long telephoto lenses, it is worthwhile switching steady shot off. Steady shot is designed to help you when the camera is in the hand, but there's a little bit of vibration set up by the motors that do that stabilization, and over long exposures or with long telephoto lenses, that can lead to slightly blurred image. So you do want to switch that off when you're going into using that with the camera on a tripod. If we look at the shutter steady shot menu, as well as silent shooting, you'll also see options for E front curtain shutter. Now, often this does appear on DSLRs, especially when you're using live view. Now, E front curtain shutter is on by default. Now, some short 2-minute movies might tell you that you should be switching it off. Now, I've got a half-hour movie on this subject, and you really only want to start switching E front curtain shutter off if you fully realize that E front curtain shutter is your friend 95% of the time, maybe more. Now, in my half-hour movie, I basically say that there is instances if you're using non-Sony lenses at wide apertures with very fast shutter speeds over 1/1000th of a second, you can get some image artifacts or some bokeh distortion that is not what you want. But if you're shooting images and there is no artifacts or uneven spread of light or anything to worry about, E front curtain shutter is generally working with you. You get a much more responsive shutter release, faster, no lag. You're getting less vibration in the camera when working with your longer exposures with the camera on a tripod. You're getting a faster frames per second when shooting action sports. You're getting a quieter shutter sound. So there's lots of advantages, which is why it's on by default. So just remember, there are some people who will try and encourage you to switch this off, and in some instances you will get advantages, but by far and away leave it on, and if in doubt, watch my movie, do a little bit of research. But again, it's another thing that you should perhaps do a little bit of research, given that you've changed from old school DSLR technology to mirrorless technologies. These cameras are not just smaller and have a mirror missing, they work in a completely different way to give you the images that in many respects are better than DSLR technologies can deliver. Another thing that you might miss, and this is again covered in a movie just about metering systems, why multi is your friend, often referred to as evaluative metering by Canon, is that if you decide to use a spot meter rather than using a very sophisticated algorithm to gauge your most appropriate exposure. Now, spot metering is usually the spot is restricted to the center of the screen. But if you're not focusing on that point as well, there is a way of linking the focus spot point to the metering spot point. So if you move the spot meter to or the AF point to the right, it also meters from that same position. So you may not have been aware of that until I show you. And again, there's a separate movie that covers metering. Coming to the end of this presentation, you're probably glad about that. I've probably been going for more than an hour. Is just a rundown of some of the terminology. Glossary of terms: autofocus, auto selection AF. This is where the camera on your Canon chooses the appropriate AF point. That is wide on a Sony, but the wide is much wider than you would have experienced on that Canon. You've got something called Auto Lighting Optimizer on your Canon, and if you're a Canon user and have been using that, you know that gets applied to movies and stills, but not to RAW. Okay, the same thing is with the Sony. It gets applied, and it's called DRO, or Dynamic Range Optimizer. It gets applied to JPEGs and movies, but not to the RAW files. But I'm mentioning it here because a lot of people say when I open my RAW file, the shadows look much darker than I remember capturing them. And that is because Dynamic Range Optimizer is on by default, and it's making the shadows appearing lighter when you're shooting the images. Helps with framing the image so we don't get such a view that's too contrasty. But just remember, you are going to have to move the shadow slider to replicate that view that you were shooting with the Sony, unless of course you switch Dynamic Range Optimizer off. I actually quite find it such a useful feature to leave on because I like the view being less contrasty. Okay, so we've got auto exposure lock. Simply that's just the AEL button. And rarely do Sony actually refer to it as automatic exposure lock, it's just AEL. We got face detect. I was slightly confused to see Canon give this very large acronym to what is simply face detect. I'm not too sure what possessed Canon to do that. Fortunately for Canon users, you probably noticed that they also put a little icon of a smiley face there. And the reason I put this in this glossary of terms is a smiley face means something different to face detect technologies. The face detect technologies is so sophisticated in the Sonys, you can actually program the Sony to only take the picture when the person smiles. Okay, so smile priority. So just remember, face detect is actually different from a smiley face. I don't use the smiley face. I take lots of pictures when people are looking serious, so I actually don't use that. I can't comment on how reliable it is, but I did want to point that out. A smiley face isn't just face detect. AI servo. I've spoken to a couple of Canon users who over the years, and they don't even know what AI stands for. They say some of the terms that Sony uses are a little bit confusing. Well, try going from Nikon to Canon and trying to work out through some of their menu items. Okay, EOS ITR-AF, okay, or AI servo, continuous AF. Continuous AF for me is a much better way of describing is the focus isn't going to lock on and then beep. It's basically just going to carry on focusing even when the subject is moving. Picture style, again a JPEG movie only feature, is creative style. Just remember, if you are using those creative styles, you may not have no impact on the RAW file, but you will change how the monitor and viewfinder look. Okay, so it does have some uses even though you may be a RAW shooter, so because it will impact on the way you view the image on the back of the screen. Evaluative metering, that is just simply multi inside of Sony's terminology. If you're looking for a time-lapse movie feature and you've gone through all of the the menu items and you realize it's missing, you can actually do time-lapse movies on the Sony. You'll find it in the S and Q. This will allow you to make beautiful slow-mo movies shooting at 100 frames per second. S and Q just means slow and quick. This will allow you to slow things down so people will move gracefully through your movies, or you can speed things up, which is the nature of time-lapse. And in that instance, you would just set your S and Q to shoot maybe 1 frame per second, and then you'll create your time-lapse movie. The S and Q, the advantage of doing it in S and Q, of course, is that it will play back at the normal frame rate. So movies will play back suitably slowly or suitably quickly without you having to do anything in the post-production movie editing software. Final one, shutter priority TV. Never watched any TV on the back of my camera. Just remember, shutter priority. Probably didn't need to say that, but I just thought I'd finish this little presentation there. So just remember, if you've got through all of this movie and you're hungry for more, I'm trying to fill this up as a one-stop shop full of useful information, and there is downloads, there's links to the movies. Subscribe to the channel first and foremost, because this is very active. The blog is active as well, and lots of post-production stuff as well. Here to support the Sony Alpha community. If you value this support, make a small donation. If you've downloaded half a dozen things and you've really valued that, just come back and make a small donation, because that does help. Okay, so that was my presentation for EOS to Alpha, and I'll just finish off by saying welcome to the Alpha community. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador.